What's up, and welcome to another episode of Unmotive Show. Today we are speaking with Dr. Gillian O'Shea Brown. She is a practicing psychotherapist who specializes in healing trauma. She is also the author of a book called Healing Complex PTSD. She has been featured in Vogue, Inc. magazine, HuffPost, Thrive Global, and more. Today we'll be talking about mental health, personal growth, and trauma in the workplace. Hi, Gillian. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for such a detailed introduction. I'm very grateful that you're opening up this space to have conversations about trauma and mental health. And I'm just really, impressed with the work that you're doing. So thank you for having me as a guest.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it because, I feel like one of the things I wanted to do with the podcast since it started was go into mental health and also try to make mental health a little fun to talk about it because, it's kind of, there's a lot of stigma involved with it that I feel like if it's more of a fun conversation we can have than between each other regarding mental health, then that'll kind of reduce the stigma.
I totally agree with you. I feel like secrecy, shame, and silence underpin stigma. And if you can make something playful or be curious about it or bring it into more light conversational spaces, then it loses its power. So 100% agree with what you're saying.
Right on. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I appreciate it. And I appreciate you taking the time out to record with me today. I know you have a busy schedule, and I was actually wanted to start off today with some questions about actual what you do, or an overview of what you do, kind of, because I'm familiar with psychologists and psychiatrists, but I'm
Yeah.
less familiar with the profession of psychotherapist. But it
Yeah.
brings to mind like the old style psychotherapy where someone's lying down in a couch and the therapist is in a chair asking questions.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
can, could you illuminate the idea of the modern psychotherapist?
So you're bringing up a really interesting question, and it's helpful for your listeners because a lot of people don't understand these terms and they use them interchangeably. So the psychiatrist
Mm-hmm.
has a medical degree, and they will do medication reconciliation with you, and some of them will do talk therapy also, but not always. And then in terms of psychology, psychologists can be trained at a very high level in terms of doing neuropsych evals, specific diagnoses around particular learning difficulties. But then the field of psychotherapy is very much just associated with what happens in the room, whether it's group or one on one or couples, in terms of the actual therapeutic experience itself. And then the roots of psychotherapy, began in Austria with psychoanalysis. And that's that very classic picture that you painted of a person sitting on the couch, they're lying down, the therapist is oriented away, there's no eye contact, you're narrating your life, and there's very little input. And that was the birthplace of psychotherapy. That is where it all began. But in the decades, since that time, specifically for trauma focused psychotherapy has moved towards being a more evidence based mind body approach. And it's not about retelling your story over and over again. Techniques like EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, somatic experiencing, internal family systems. It has become much more of a relational dynamic. And my area, which is complex trauma, which is the trauma that occurs in the context of relationships. Relational trauma needs relational repair. So how safe you feel in that partnership is very paramount to your healing process.
Right. Thank you for that. That's very clear. It was also very, very long, but some things I picked up were that, you have to feel safe with a psychotherapist, which is something I've heard before for other types of therapy, and also that it was started in Austria, which is so I guess the movie, I learned it from movies. I didn't know it started in Austria, but that's kind of the where people got introduced to. Some people were introduced to psychotherapy through movies and film. So you like is I wanted to does it have anything to do with Freudian psychology, or is that That's another thing I'm kind of curious about.
Yeah, so I actually really love the theories of Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung, and there are
Hmm.
particular ones that really underpin my work. And one in particular from Freud that I find very powerful. It's called repetition compulsion. And what it is in life, when something happens to us that's very jarring or confusing, we have this human impulse to repeat it in order to understand. And sometimes you might notice with traumatic or painful events in your own life that there's a particular Achilles heel or a negative cognition. And every time it gets pressed on, it's the bite that fits the wound and it keeps getting activated over and over and over again. And
Hmm.
when you notice cyclical patterns in your life in terms of relational patterns or reliving the same pain, it's important to look at the feeling state behind the behavior. And if you're repeating something continuously in order to learn from it. And the classic example is, the person that has the deep, let's say, mother wound and
Hmm.
pine for the love they never receive, and they accept the love they believe they deserve, and they inadvertently find themselves in partnerships with people that are of the same personality archetype. So the Freudian theories and the work of Carl Jung still very much underpin the work of today, and they would be, some of the pillars of psychotherapy.
Okay. Yeah, I'm familiar with IFS, and that sounds kind of where you started with the recurring themes uh,
Mhm.
in your life that are related to maybe past traumas. That sounds kind of like EDMR. I wanted to maybe talk about that. EDMR and IFS are two I'm familiar with. I'm actually going through IFS counseling, so the first half sounded of what you said sounded like EDMR, and then the last half sounded like IFS, internal family systems.
Yeah,
And so maybe if we could get into a little bit about those, since I'm familiar with them and I can kind
yeah.
of speak to them as well.
Well, just to be clear, repetition compulsion was a theory that came into being in the early, 1910s, 1914. And then about in the 1980s, EMDR, eye movement desensitization, was established. And then
EMDR.
in 1991, internal family systems came into being. So the theory of why do we repeat the same pain over and over again, and that
Hmm.
question that was out there in the ether, and then these modalities that were created in the last 30 years, relatively recently, they are attempting to answer and disrupt the pattern and pave the way for a new future because you know from your own work that the unexamined history is doomed to repetition.
Yeah, definitely. I've actually heard that too about like people who. It also brought to mind people who date the same type of person over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't really thought of that having to do with trauma. I thought it more had to do with like I don't know, personal tastes.
Okay, okay. Is that something you've noticed in your own life?
Yeah, a little bit, a little bit. I haven't had too many long term relationships, but definitely both of my long term relationships, they were very similar people. Although they were different in certain respects, they were also like,
Yeah.
they had different, the same types of. They were both like internationals from different countries. So I thought it was just because that was the luck of, you know, the
Mhm.
luck of the draw, but I think that it probably did have a little bit to do with like maybe not trauma, but like past experiences.
And you feel that the pattern or the themes or the personalities had some similarities?
Yes, yes, and they were both college educated. A few things, yeah, there were definitely a few similarities. Yes,
What kind of similarities?
they were both quiet, very quiet, soft spoken. When they were normal. Sometimes and they all had a penchant for they both had a penchant for like party, like because they were so quiet they kind of balanced it off with going to, kind of partying and going to parties and like stuff like that.
Yeah.
Although later on the most recent girlfriend was still in school, so she didn't really partake in that too much, but I felt like she did have that side of her that was like kind of the wild side. And they were both internationals. One was from Hawaii or out of town. So one was Japanese from Hawaii, and then the other woman was from Liberia.
And then in terms of, these past relationships that didn't work out the way you hoped, do you know why?
Yeah. They all ended because of actually mental health trauma. Because I had problems with different mental health things, and I had to go to the hospital actually. For both of them, and so that was pretty much it was related to having problems with my mental health, and also other things, like because
Yeah.
they were they were both kind of into partying a little bit, so I got into that too. I was already into that. That's kind of where I met them, except one of them, and so I started going to parties and stuff, and it also related to, like, all the other stuff you do at parties, like drinking and stuff
Mhm.
like that. Yeah.
So the romantic partnerships can exacerbate, old wounds, old symptoms.
Yeah. I can feel that too. Yeah.
They can be dysregulating, and when you're on a healing journey as you are, and there's certain pillars that make you feel really good and really solid, and that gets interrupted when you bring another person into the dynamic. It's not the way the heart works, because the heart's not always logical, but it's a good question to ask. What kind of partner do I need to support my wellness, or who would I what kind of person would make me feel more like myself, so you're not.
Wow. I love that. I love that. Yeah. That's an important question to ask. It's not something, with lust, and you know how
Yeah.
you go after someone who's like you're physically attracted to, oftentimes. Although I think for women it's a little different, but at least I used to, and that's something, as an adult. I haven't dated anybody in 10 years, but definitely I want to, like, do that in the future. Like, who will make me feel more like myself? Who am not just who am I comfortable with or who I'm attracted to, but actually ask, like, more mature questions. I feel like that's a part of maturity, is being able to process emotions that way and make choices that way as well.
That's very well said. And a lot of my clients that are actively dating with discernment,
Hmm.
I'll ask them to keep a running log in the notes section of their phone, just to write 3 I am statements after spending a couple of hours with someone. Some people are going to make you feel funny, interesting, desirable. And there are other people that, yes, you might be very attracted to them, but you
Hmm.
always walk away feeling belittled, not good enough, unworthy, that they inflame all of your insecurities. So, just that simple exercise alone of just noticing the way a person makes you feel, it can be a
Hmm.
choice when you're deciding, am I going to just continue dating, or am I going to actually progress this to the next level? And it's all about the cumulative hours of harmonious contact, and proximity magnifies emotions. Like if you were stuck in an elevator with someone for a few hours, you'll either become best friends or you'll never want to see them again.
Is that like what it's like in a relationship, kind of being stuck in an elevator with somebody? Is that,
I mean,
I don't know, maybe I'm,
for people that were in partnerships during the pandemic, I think it really was.
oh, okay. Yeah.
I think that close quarters and not being able to socialize outside, it put a lot of pressure on relationships. But just going to the exercise of the 3 I ams after dates and after those early, periods of time together is super helpful in terms of breaking old patterns. And sometimes it's the simplest little exercises of self-awareness that help you to create a new pathway.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of like journaling for general journaling. I would like to say I practice that a little bit.
Good.
So I think I could get it. I could do that, and I think that might also motivate people to even get to, like, maybe people who are kind of like shy or don't want to get into relationships or have a hard time finding relationships. It may also help them, like, kind
Mm.
of having that directed activity might also help them find relationships and actually get out of their comfort zone and find the people that they most like to be around.
I couldn't agree more. And Self-awareness is so important because the longest relationship you'll have in your life is the relationship you have with yourself. And
Mm,
if that is a good, curious, compassionate, understanding relationship, you're really setting the groundwork for bringing another person into the dynamic. So, journaling and self-awareness and self-care, it's an excellent primer in terms of preparing yourself for love.
right, right. Thanks for that. Yeah, I wanted to get back into EDMR a little bit because I know from what I've learned, EDMR is like something that helps with physical trauma a lot because it has to do with you could probably explain it a little better, but I used to be a skateboarder, right? And I went through like a decade of, I almost call it self-harm right now. And that's what
Mm.
I feel about it. But I feel like a lot of my lingering problems with mental health are have to do with all the pain I put myself through as a skateboarder.
Yeah,
Yeah, so a decade of trying dangerous tricks, coming
yeah,
home injured, and just like some really serious injuries. A couple smaller minor bruises, but then
yeah.
a couple serious injuries as well.
Well, you're bringing up a really important topic, and I will answer your question, but
Okay.
there's self-harm and then there's indirect self-harm. And
Oh.
indirect self-harm is when you put yourself in risky situations. Um, Sometimes a person will walk through the dangerous part of the city late at night, open to being attacked. I've had some clients reveal this to me, that they themselves won't self-harm, but they're opening themselves up to risk in this kind of morally masochistic way. Or the
Hmm.
risk behaviors could be around sexuality, or it could be around these sporting activities. And, behind every behavior is a feeling, and behind every feeling is a need. And doing these risky skateboarding stunts at the time, what was the feeling that it would give you when you would,
Right.
can you elaborate on the feeling state?
Uh, Yeah, so for me, I was around people who it was kind of community. I felt like a sense of community almost because it was a very
Mhm.
smaller subsection of people from I was around that were into that type of thing, and it was really close friends that became very close. So there was a lot of a sense of almost a sense of community, a sense of identity, I would say.
And then pushing the boat out and being more risky, where you were
Yeah,
wanting to be seen as a courageous, skillful
yeah,
skater.
yeah.
Okay, so it
Yeah,
was actually,
people
it
gave me compliments like that too, and I would
was,
kind of probably took them to heart a little too much.
and then the compliments made you feel,
I felt, I actually felt like in modesty. I was trying to be modest about it. I was like, I've kind of pushed
yeah,
them under the rug, but at the same time, they did affect me a little bit and made me try
yeah.
a little harder to be a little better at the sport.
Well, it sounds like the positive reinforcement of people seeing that you were courageous and skillful made you feel really good. You wanted more of that. You pushed the boat out. You hurt yourself. But underneath all of it, you just wanted the feeling of acceptance and belonging. And that's
Yeah.
something
So,
wants. It's a very natural thing. But I want to go back to your question because I know you.
oh yeah, the EDMR.
So, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It was created in the 1980s, and it was created by Francine Shapiro. And she got a cancer diagnosis when she was in college, and she kind of had this pretty much a life crisis. She felt very, what we would call cognitively hyper aroused, which is racing thoughts, racing heartbeat, really
Mm,
dysregulated. So she went for a walk in nature and she noticed a correlation between moving her eyes back and forth and emotion, and it took down the sharpness of the emotions. So
mm,
originally she just was interested in, oh, is there a correlation or a relationship between eye movement and, regulating your emotions? And so then she went about, undertaking qualitative research, establishing the EMDR technique,
EMDR. Right.
which is eye movement desensitization. And then reprocessing is that you're reliving the event and you're changing the meaning of the event. Now, since that time, 10 years ago, the World Health Organization, back in 2013, a whole decade ago, they did a meta analysis of all of the qualitative research of evidence based trauma. modalities, and they made a statement that EMDR was their first choice of trauma treatment therapy for people with PTSD. So for the past decade, it's been the most evidence-based best practice guideline. And basically what EMDR does is that when you have a trauma memory in your brain, it often feels like a skipping disc or vinyl where you keep replaying the most painful part over and over again. But with EMDR, you have particular target memories. And she famously said there's 10 to 20 memories in your life responsible for all of the pain. And processing each one is like taking a log out of the fire. So you take a memory and you talk about the image that represents the most distressing part, the meaning you made of it, the I am meaning, how distressing it is on a scale of 0 to 10. And through an 8-phase protocol with bilateral stimulation, which is sometimes it's beeps in alternative ears, sometimes it's with a therapulse, or sometimes the eyes are being guided with fingers. It's very like rapid eye movement in your sleep. You go through the protocol of reducing the distress associated with the memory. And then sometimes you will actually go back into the memory and compassionately witness and rescue your earlier self, or be with yourself in the way you needed someone to be with you in that moment. Because most traumatic memories are very lonely experiences. And to quote Peter Levine, trauma is not what happens to you, it's what you carry in the inside in the absence of a compassionate witness. So all trauma modalities involve some level of compassionate witnessing. Because when trauma happens, it's fast, it's painful, it's lonely. Sometimes you don't get to react, you feel frozen and you're internalizing your emotions. So the compassionate witnessing and the catharsis, the release, that's so important.
Yeah, the catharsis, right? I've heard that term for, like crying or weeping.
Exactly.
Also,
I like to call crying unburdening, because if you can be non-resistant and you can allow the pain to flow through you, you will inevitably feel so much lighter. And it's kind of like, the elements. Water is often considered the most powerful element because it can nourish a field of crops or it can wear away a rock. And it's powerful because of its non-resistance. And if you're non-resistant to the emotions that flow through you, they don't get calcified and stuck in the inside. And the thing about emotions is that we can't selectively numb our emotions. We either numb all of them or none of them. So for a lot of people that come to trauma therapy, they will say, I really want to get my feelings back, because they feel so numbed out of all of their emotions.
Right. So I feel like I just wanted to make one comment and then I'm going to ask another question. But so if maybe you could just give a short, brief response to this. So it feels like there may be a little bit of a difference between male and female processing of emotion. I mean, obviously there's the general, like, the general thoughts about that, some negative, some positive. Like women are better at multitasking, or men don't cry as, it's men shouldn't cry, stuff like that. So do you have any, like, maybe a brief response to like how men and women differ in your treatment?
That's interesting. So, back in the 1990s, that was a really big topic. With books like "Men Are from Mars, Women Are from Venus."
Yeah, I remember that one.
Majority of my clients are male, and
Okay.
I don't see a huge difference in the genders, to be honest. I know that with males, there can sometimes be a toxic masculinity of learned behaviors where, you're more encouraged to numb out. But by the time a male comes to therapy and they are saying, here's the presenting issues, here's what I want to work on, here's what I want to achieve. And by the time we collaborate and identify shared memories that are actively intruding on their present and causing them pain, they will lean into the discomfort of working through those memories. And I personally have not noticed too much of a deviation in terms of where I work with men, women, or non-binary clients. I feel like the trauma resolution process is deeply personal and individual to every person.
Mm,
People are more expressive. Some people have actually, if they're tearful, they will request me to look away because they learned that it was very shameful to cry.
hmm
Some people don't cry at all. And some people release more through anger, releases of anger or other tension. And whatever that experience of release and catharsis is, it's unique. But there are a lot of men in terms of, you know, with your generation or the generation below who are actively in treatment and peeling back the layers and undoing the past wounds. And I think that it's a really beautiful and courageous thing.
right, right. Yeah, thanks for that. I feel like I am part of that group that's been trying therapy and trying to peel back the layers and figure
Mm.
out how to, achieve goals in life and make myself a better person and stuff like that. Even not just to the outside world, but for myself. And so that I also wanted to get into trauma in the workplace. So I was kind of curious about what that has to do with it. With therapy and we did a past interview with somebody who actually promotes that in his workplace and gives people mental health time off instead of
Yeah.
and like gives them medical insurance and encourages them to go to therapy and things like that.
Well, the type of trauma that I work with is complex trauma, relational trauma. So it's often,
Complex trauma.
which is basically a lot, and trauma comes from the Greek word for wound. So it's a lot of wound, or it could be the death by 100 cuts, 1,000 wounds. So relational trauma is more the repeated behaviors that make you feel unworthy, less than, not good enough, shameful. And if you were to look at a pie chart of your waking hours and how many hours you're asleep, how many hours you're in work, how many hours you're at home, work based relationships are actually very significant. And if there's communication deviance or manipulation or coercive control or bullying behaviors or microaggressions, discrimination in the workplace, it can really erode the ego. And it's very stifling to creative thinking and lateral thinking and productivity if you feel like you're walking on eggshells and day in and day out and you don't feel safe. And for a lot of people, the trauma, relational trauma in the workplace is the bite that fits the wound to the way they felt during some of the formative memories in households where they didn't feel safe, respected, or heard. So cultivating safety in the workplace is very, very important. And I feel that by creating a language and a dialogue and a way of being and compassionate witnessing, you can open up relationships to be much more respectful and free flowing and communicative and therefore and teamwork and ultimately productivity. So it's very, very important.
Right. Yeah, that sounds pretty on point. I was just curious about so I've read a little bit about business management and stuff like that. And maybe taking a couple classes on it too. And there's this idea that managers probably make a good difference in how that the mental health or the trauma or what you're talking about, the safety in the workplace is achieved. And there are different types of managers. Some are very friendly and care about their employees and how their employees look at them and how their employees feel and stuff like that and how they're working and what their goals are. And others are just very how do you say it? More like military directors, I guess is the thing that comes to mind right now. So in situations where you can't get the manager to, kind of like you're forced into a complex trauma situation, how can somebody deal with that? And you can't change it.
Well, it's very tricky because, as you said, there's different managerial styles and people that can be very militant, and they're very coercive in their managerial style. They tend to operate echo chambers where
Mm,
it's very hard for you to have critical thinking or to disagree or to offer an alternative point of view. But also, people get really scared around whistleblowing when they see that there's something very wrong here. And trauma leaves behind clues. Even work based trauma leaves behind clues. You might notice that underneath a certain manager, there's a lot of people going on short term disability, where a lot of people are not complaining, but they're leaving. Or there's just a general sense of stagnancy or lack of productivity in the team, or you can just feel the tension. And I actually think it's important not to respond to the chaos, but to proactively put in place preventative practices to cultivate the right culture and environment so that you can optimize relationships that will bring about the shared goal. So I don't think it's about reacting to problems. I think it's about getting in front of them and creating the culture before the problems emerge.
Before the problems emerge. Yeah, I feel like that's easier said than done in some cases. So, have you worked as kind of with HR departments or done any work within a company to make that kind of change, maybe as a contractor or yeah.
Yes, I have a complex trauma course that I do one for therapists that are, learning to treat complex trauma. But then I also do a course that creates a trauma informed culture in the workplace. And I offer that to teams in the workplace. And that could
Mm,
from upper management to C suite to HR to the people on the floor doing the real work. And it's really about fostering a sense of cross disciplinary collaboration and
mhm.
establishing clear communication patterns that make people feel safe and connected and respected and nurtured. And I think it's important that anyone with a sense of authority that they learn that there's a powerful element to protection, nurturance, and guidance in the workplace. And that you really are in that role where you have to guide people. And when you put a lot of people together and proximity magnifies emotions, and then you put in a lot of stress and different personalities, there will often be conflicts and alliances arising, and that can be very challenging. And I
Yeah,
also feel like understanding how present day triggers can activate old wounds and how you can create more of a sense of community and connection in a workplace. Not only does it make a person want to stay somewhere longer because they love the culture, but they can contribute in a more richer, individualistic way.
right on, right on. Yeah, so yeah, that definitely sounds complex. That sounds complex to me. Yeah. Now you need somebody to kind of guide you through those complex feelings. And I was also wondering, so with all this complex trauma we've been talking about and all the different modalities we talked about, and also all the different situations where complex trauma can come into play, how would somebody know once their trauma has been healed?
That's a great question. So, in my experience, the definition of trauma is when the past intrudes upon your present. And sometimes there is underneath all the numbing and the distraction in life when you're alone with your thoughts. What is your self story? Is it a self story of feeling worthy, courageous, calm, creative, ready to connect? Or is there a lot of deep, shameful thoughts? If there's a lot of deep, shameful thoughts and limiting beliefs, then those were learned through painful life experiences, and there is trauma to be healed. And then outside of that, your behavioral patterns, do you feel like your behaviors are in alignment with your personal values?
Right.
If you value forward progression, but you spend most of your life in numbing and distraction, then that's important too, because as I said before, behind every behavior is a feeling, and behind every feeling is a need. There might be a defense mechanism at play that's trying to protect you from something that you're fearful of that is
Mm,
represented in moving forward. So, looking at the clues that trauma leaves behind in your thoughts, in your behaviors, and in your relationships, that will start to tell you if everything is healed and congruent, or if there's a little bit more work to be done.
Okay, so kind of if you feel, if you still feel, if you're going through therapy, because I assume like some people who aren't going through therapy, they may
Mhm.
not be aware of these feelings and therefore they can't really get to that point without therapy. I don't know how much that is true, but if you're getting some kind of like conflict or like you said, shame or any feelings, negative feelings when you're thinking about things that are positive, it's kind of like a cognitive dissonance thing, it sounds like. So when you're thinking about something positive and you get some conflict there, feel a conflict there arising, then that's when you still have trauma. Once your positive values and your positive feelings equal up, then that's more like when you've healed trauma. Is that correct?
Well, if you are outside of the numbing and the distraction, and you're allowing your thoughts and emotions to come to the surface, and you're taking a moment to listen from within, is the internal dialogue, I am good enough, I'm worthy of love, I'm capable, I trust myself? Or is it the opposite? Is there a lot of negative beliefs? And if there is, don't be afraid of them. Meet them with a sense of curiosity, write them down, and ask yourself, when in my life have I felt this way the most? And usually you'll get key target memories. And those memories are actually the logs in the fire to be processed. And
Okay.
by unburdening from them, you'll feel more yourself. And there's a quote that I love from Michelangelo, who carved the David. And he said, the angel was always in the marble, and I carved until I set it free. Beneath all the trauma and the self-limiting beliefs, the defense mechanisms and the fear is the authentic self. And
Hmm.
that's what all trauma healing is about, is who are you before all of the pain, and who are you beyond, the numbing and distracting behaviors, the defense mechanisms, and the past painful memories.
Okay. Thanks for that. I think that's a good place to close today with a nice quote. I love quotes too, so that's
Good.
perfect for me. Hope our listeners appreciate the effort we've taken today to make mental health more approachable. And I feel like it's more approachable for me. I honestly feel like I can do some of this work without a counselor now that I've done this podcast.
Yeah, because I feel like the more you educate yourself and you just meet it with a sense of optimism, playfulness, and curiosity, like you do,
Hmm.
you can tap into your own internal wisdom, and you can be your own therapist in that regard. I know it gets to a certain level sometimes, especially with suicidal ideation, self-harm, disassociation, where you really need that licensed mental health professional. But the foundational work of getting to know yourself and your self-study, I feel like that's a relationship everyone can begin with themselves.
Yeah, definitely. So in closing, thank you for being with us today. This has been really wonderful. Do you have anything you want to close with, or maybe any your website or any places where people can find out more about you?
Oh yes. So my website is Dr. Gillian O'Shea Brown, and I'm pretty active on Instagram and TikTok and Facebook under Dr. Gillian O'Shea Brown, and Twitter under Dr. O'Shea Brown. I like to share a lot of resources in terms of journaling, meditation, psychoeducation around trauma, and a lot of it is items that you can use yourself at home or you can share with a loved one. I also have a newsletter that I release every 2 weeks, and it's basically trauma informed self care tips, journaling prompts, and exciting updates in the field. So basically, I'm just trying to be helpful to anyone that's on their healing journey. And if you're looking for some tips and tricks and resources, I would be honored if you followed me.
So there'll be links to all this during the show notes, and you guys can check out more about her and her work healing trauma. And if you're interested, and if I implore people, if anything in their life seems off, that mental health and is not something to be afraid of. It's something to be embraced. So thanks again for being with us, Jillian.
Thank you so much for having me.